He built one of the most photographed bodies in professional wrestling history. Chiseled, symmetrical, a physique that made Vince McMahon put him in the main event of the first WrestleMania. But on the last night of his life, the right side of that body was completely paralyzed. Dead weight. Useless. His son had to escort him to bed from the weak side, terrified he would fall. And then, in a moment that defied every medical explanation his family would ever receive, that paralyzed right arm moved one final time. Just once. Just enough to say goodbye. And the moment his family sat by his bed and watched a man who had once been called the second biggest draw in the entire wrestling business take his final breath. It is one of the most quietly devastating deaths in wrestling history, and by the time we reach the end, you will understand exactly what the concussions took from him, and what he somehow managed to hold on to until the very last second. But before we get to those final 48 hours, you need to understand the man who was fading away in that Fayetteville, Georgia bedroom. You need to understand what made his death mean something. Because a broken body is only a tragedy if you know how magnificent that body used to be. Paul Orndorff Jr. was born on October 29, 1949 in Winchester, Virginia, and raised in Brandon, Florida. He was an elite athlete before he ever thought about wrestling. At the University of Tampa, he was a bruising running back who scored 21 career touchdowns and racked up over 2,000 all-purpose yards. In 1973, the New Orleans Saints drafted him in the 12th round. He failed the physical. That failure sent him to the World Football League, where he spent a season with the Jacksonville Sharks before the league collapsed underneath him. By 1976, he had walked into a wrestling school in Florida and started training under legends of the business: Jack Briscoe, Hiro Matsuda, Eddie Graham, Bob Backlund. These were not soft teachers. They were the men who had built the Florida territory into one of the toughest, most technically demanding schools in the country. And Orndorff thrived in it. He had the football background, he had the aggression, he had the work ethic. Within a few years, he was a headliner across the Southern Territories, feuding with Jerry Lawler in Memphis, tearing up Mid-South, chasing Ric Flair for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in Georgia. Then, in 1983, Vince McMahon came calling. McMahon was building something new. He was taking the World Wrestling Federation national. He was raiding every territory in the country for the best talent, the biggest stars, the men who could carry his brand into markets that had never seen it before. And Paul Orndorff was one of his first big pickups, the Brandon Bull, the chiseled football player with the natural charisma and the movie star jawline. McMahon saw a prototype. By January 1984, Orndorff had a new manager. Roddy Piper gave him a new nickname, Mr. Wonderful, and that name stuck. 15 months later, he stood in the main event of the first WrestleMania at Madison Square Garden, teaming with Piper against Hulk Hogan and Mr. T. There was a movie star at ringside. Muhammad Ali was the enforcer. Liberace was the timekeeper. And Orndorff was in the ring, taking bumps in front of a national closed-circuit audience that had never seen anything like it before. He was 35 years old. He was in the physical prime of his life, and he was about to enter the most lucrative 18 months any professional wrestler had experienced up to that point. The heel turn on Hogan came a little over a year later. Orndorff had been aligned with Hogan as a babyface. They had been tag partners, best friends on television. Then, in one of the most perfectly executed swerves in wrestling history, Orndorff clotheslined Hogan out of nowhere and delivered a pile driver that folded the champion up like an accordion. Hogan sold it like his neck had snapped. The crowd exploded in shock. Fans in the front row grabbed their heads. Kids started crying. This was the moment. This was the payoff. Mr. Wonderful had turned. And the story that followed drew money like nothing the industry had seen before. For 18 months, Paul Orndorff was the biggest heel in professional wrestling. He drew heat like a lightning rod. He would walk to the ring cupping his ear to hear the boos, soaking them in like they were cheers. Every single night, in arena after arena, thousands of fans would show up specifically to see Hulk Hogan get his hands on Paul Orndorff. On August 28, 1986, they wrestled at Exhibition Stadium in Toronto. The event was called The Big Event. It drew over 61,000 paid customers and roughly 800,000 Canadian dollars in gate revenue. The old wrestling wisdom was that only Andre the Giant could draw against Hulk Hogan. Paul Orndorff proved that wisdom wrong. He was the second biggest draw of that era. Not by a small margin, by a country mile. And it was during that run, in the absolute peak of his earning power, that the injury happened. Nobody quite agrees on how it happened. Some accounts say he tore something in the gym while lifting heavy. Some accounts say it happened in the ring during one of the hundreds of house shows he was working with Hogan. Some accounts say it was a combination of both. What everyone agrees on is what it was. It was a spinal injury. Nerve damage in his neck. The kind of injury that a normal person would have taken 6 months off to heal, maybe a year, maybe surgery. Paul Orndorff took nothing. He was in the biggest money run of his life. He was headlining arenas coast to coast. He was drawing $800,000 gates in Toronto. He was pulling checks that were about to change his family's entire financial future. And he was not going to stop. He was not going to hand the run off to someone else. He was not going to disappear from television for a year and hope that Vince McMahon remembered him when he came back. He was going to work through it. He was going to grit his teeth and pop pain pills and lift with his good arm and hide the damage and just keep going. For a while, he got away with it. The photos from 1986 and 1987 show a man who still looked like a Greek statue. But the pinched nerve was already doing its work. The signal from his brain to the muscles on the right side of his body was slowly being choked off. And muscles that do not get signals from the brain start to shrink. It is called atrophy. And it is a slow, humiliating, one-way process. By 1988, the atrophy was visible. He left the WWE that year, quietly, with an untreated neck injury and a right side that was already starting to waste away. He came back in 1990 for WCW. He tried to keep going. He formed a tag team with Paul Roma called Pretty Wonderful. He won the WCW World Television Championship. He held it for 169 days. He worked with everyone from Cactus Jack to Mean Mark Callis, the future Undertaker. He was still good. He was still Paul Orndorff. But his body was betraying him a little more every year. By the mid-90s, the atrophy had spread. It was not just the arm anymore. The right side of his body was shrinking. The bicep, the tricep, the shoulder, eventually the leg. The nerve damage in his neck was strangling every signal that tried to travel down that side of his body. And there was nothing anyone could do. He had waited too long. The damage was permanent. On the December 11, 1995 episode of Monday Nitro, WCW wrote him off television. The storyline was that Brian Pillman had disrespected him, and that Ric Flair and Arn Anderson delivered a spike pile driver to him on the arena floor. Fans thought it was a wrestling angle. It was not. WCW was covering for a real medical retirement. Paul Orndorff could no longer wrestle at the level his pride demanded. His right side was atrophying beyond the point where his body could hide it. He tried to come back one more time. On September 17, 2000, at Fall Brawl in Buffalo, New York, he was announced as the surprise partner for the Filthy Animals in an elimination tag match against the Natural Born Thrillers, a group of young wrestlers he had personally trained at the WCW power plant. He was 50 years old. He was in there with kids in their 20s. And in the middle of that match, he delivered a pile driver. He collapsed, motionless, on his back in the middle of the ring. The referee, Charles Robinson, waved the match off immediately. Fans watching at home saw a sequence they would never forget. The other wrestlers freezing in place. The commentary team going silent because they realized this was not part of the show. This was real. Medical staff rushed the ring. He was carried out on a stretcher through a stunned arena. And this time, there would be no coming back. The 2000 Fall Brawl was the last real match Paul Orndorff ever worked. He was carried out of a wrestling ring at the age of 50, and he never wrestled a full match again. He transitioned into a full-time role as a trainer at the WCW power plant, molding a generation of young wrestlers that included men who would go on to have long careers in the business. He was inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame in 2005, presented by his old adversary Bobby Heenan. He was inducted into the National Wrestling Alliance Hall of Fame in 2009. He was inducted into the George Tragos Luthez Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2017. He received every honor the industry had to give. And he continued to lift. He continued to train. He continued as best he could to look like Mr. Wonderful. But the body was still failing him, piece by piece, year by year. In January of 2011, on the Busted Open Sirius satellite radio show, Orndorff revealed something that shocked the wrestling world. He had been diagnosed with throat cancer. Stage 4. He was in critical condition. He was on a feeding tube. Doctors had told him he had days to live. The industry braced for the worst. Fans lit candles. Wrestlers said their goodbyes. And then, 7 months later, in August of 2011, he announced that the cancer was gone. He had beaten it. He had walked into the fire and walked back out. Doctors told him it was a miracle. His family celebrated. The wrestling world exhaled. Mr. Wonderful was still standing, but there was another kind of damage that no one could see yet. Damage that was not showing up on any medical scan in 2011. Damage that was hiding in the folds of his brain, accumulating quietly, waiting. Because Paul Orndorff had taken a lot of pile drivers. He had given a lot of pile drivers. He had been dropped on his head hundreds of times across a 25-year career. He had absorbed thousands of unprotected bumps. He had wrestled in an era before concussion protocols, before anyone in the business was talking about brain injuries, before anyone knew that a man could get his bell rung so many times that his neurons would eventually stop firing. The first signs were small. Family members noticed him repeating stories, forgetting names, getting confused about what day it was. Nothing dramatic, just the kinds of small memory lapses that most people would brush off as normal aging. He was in his 60s. It was easy to explain away. But the signs got bigger, and they got harder to explain away. In 2016, his name appeared on a class action lawsuit filed against WWE. The lawsuit alleged that professional wrestlers had suffered long-term neurological injuries from their careers, and that the company had routinely failed to care for them and had fraudulently misrepresented and concealed the nature and extent of those injuries. The lawsuit was led by attorney Konstantin Kiros. Paul Orndorff was one of the plaintiffs. It was one of the earliest public signs that he knew something was wrong with his brain. The lawsuit did not go well. In September of 2018, U.S. District Judge Vanessa Lynn Bryant dismissed the case, ruling that some of the claims were frivolous and that others had been filed after the statute of limitations had expired. An appeal was dismissed in September of 2020. The wrestlers got nothing, and Paul Orndorff kept getting worse. By 2018, he was in financial trouble. He nearly lost his home. He had failed to pay property tax. His son Travis set up a GoFundMe with a $10,000 goal to save the house. Fans hit that goal in a single day. That was how much people still loved Mr. Wonderful. But the money was a symptom. The real problem was that Paul Orndorff was no longer capable of managing his own affairs. The paperwork had gotten confusing to him. Bills went unpaid. Dates were missed. His brain, the thing that had helped him navigate a life in one of the most complicated businesses on the planet, was starting to fail him. By 2020, the decline had accelerated dramatically. And this is where the story turns dark. Because what happened to Paul Orndorff in the last year of his life was not just the story of a former athlete losing his cognitive abilities. It was something worse. And when his son Travis finally spoke about it publicly, the entire wrestling world was forced to reckon with it. Travis Orndorff would later tell interviewer The Hannibal TV that his father had been abused. Not by strangers, not by professional caregivers, by people in his own household. Travis described it as verbal, emotional, and physical abuse, going on over the course of at least a year. He said that he had filed multiple adult protective services orders trying to get authorities to intervene. He said he could not get any traction. Nobody would help him. Nobody would investigate. And then his father was hospitalized. And when the hospital tried to contact family, they were told, according to Travis, that no immediate family members were available. Travis did not even know his father was in the hospital. He could not visit. Not because he did not want to, but because this was during COVID, and he had not been vaccinated yet, and only vaccinated visitors were being allowed inside. The moment Travis got his second shot, he went to the hospital. He walked into the room, and what he saw changed everything. He would later say, describing that moment, that there was no way what he was looking at had happened overnight. It had happened over a year. His father was in a state so bad that the man he had known as the second biggest heel in the WWE, the man who had drawn $800,000 gates in Toronto, was reduced to something Travis could barely recognize. The atrophied right side, the eyes that had trouble focusing, the mouth that had trouble finding words. And more than the physical decline, something else. Something in his father's spirit that was gone. Travis went home and made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He decided he was going to post a video. He was going to show the world what his father had been reduced to. And he was going to hope that somebody, somewhere, would care enough to intervene. He knew what it would look like. He knew fans would be angry. He knew wrestlers would criticize him. He knew his father, if his father could have understood what was happening, would probably have been furious that anyone was seeing him this way. But Travis was out of options. He had filed the paperwork. He had called the authorities. He had done everything the system told him to do, and nothing had happened. His father was still deteriorating. Nobody was coming to help. The video was the last card he had left to play. On May 8, 2021, that video went up on Instagram. It showed Paul Orndorff, 71 years old, sitting in a medical facility, unable to speak coherently, unable to focus, unable to move his right side. It was one of the most brutal pieces of footage the wrestling community had ever seen. Mr. Wonderful, the man with the movie star jawline and the 22-inch arms, was gone. What remained was a shell. The backlash was immediate. Longtime fans said Paul would have hated being seen like that. Wrestlers reached out privately to say Travis had crossed a line. The Orndorff family got hate mail. Travis got threats. People accused him of exploiting his father, of using a dying man for social media attention, of turning his father's decline into a spectacle. Travis eventually took the video down, but not before it had done what he needed it to do, because within weeks of that video going public, doctors, lawyers, and eventually the medical system started paying attention. Travis was able to get his father transferred. He was able to establish decision-making authority. He was able to start planning the last chapter of his father's life on his own terms. And in the first week of July 2021, he did something that most people in his situation would not have had the courage to do. He walked into the medical facility where his father was living, and he took him home. He was going to spend his father's remaining days at his own house, not in an institution, not surrounded by strangers, not hooked up to machines, home, family, real food, real conversations, even if his father could barely follow them. Real love, even if his father could barely say it back. Travis brought Paul into his home. He set up a bedroom. He arranged the care. He got hospice supplies. He made sure his father was comfortable. And then, for the next few days, he tried to give him something like peace. And this is where our story arrives at the final 48 hours. Sunday, July 11th, 2021. Fayetteville, Georgia. Paul Orndorff was in his son's home. He had been out of the medical facility for a matter of days. The atrophy on his right side had gotten so severe that his right arm was essentially paralyzed. He could not lift it. He could not use it. He could not even hold objects with the hand. The right side of his face drooped slightly. His voice was quiet. He tired easily. He slept a lot. But he was home. And that mattered. His granddaughter, Travis's niece, was there. Travis's wife was there. It was a small family gathering. Nobody was pretending anything was going to get better. Everyone knew what this was. This was the last stretch. This was hospice at home. This was the goodbye chapter. And on that Sunday, into the early hours of Monday, Paul Orndorff did something that surprised his family. He stayed up late. Later than usual. Everyone had expected him to fade early. Everyone had expected him to sleep most of the day. But on that particular night, he was awake. He was engaged. He was present. He was, in whatever limited way his broken brain would allow, there. Travis walked into the room around 11:30 at night. His father was sitting up, awake, watching what was happening. Travis, in a small gesture of normalcy, offered his father a beer. It was non-alcoholic. He was not going to give a 71-year-old man in end-stage dementia real alcohol, but he wanted him to feel like himself. He wanted him to feel like a man who could still enjoy a cold beer with his son. So he asked, "Dad, do you want a beer?" Paul lit up. His face changed, and he said the two words that his son would carry with him for the rest of his life. Oh yeah, just those two words. Not spoken with the crisp confidence of the man who had cut promos on Hulk Hogan in 1986. Not spoken with the intensity that had drawn boos from 70,000 fans in Toronto. Spoken quietly, simply, like a child being offered a treat. Oh yeah. Travis went and got him a beer. He poured it into a glass. He brought it back. And then something happened that his father should not have been able to do. Paul got up. He stood. And he wrapped his son up in a hug. A tight one. A real one. He pulled him in with everything he had left. He held on. And in that moment, Travis's wife took a photograph. That photograph would become the last image Travis would ever have of his father conscious and standing. His father, thin now, a shadow of the physique that had once been photographed for every wrestling magazine in the world. His right arm hanging limp at his side, his left arm wrapped around his son, his face pressed into his son's shoulder. Both of them, in that quiet room, in that quiet house, saying goodbye without knowing it yet. The strength in that hug surprised Travis. Even after everything, even after the dementia and the atrophy and the years of decline, his father could still find enough left in his frame to squeeze him tight. It was as if some deep, protective instinct that had been buried underneath all the damage was reaching up one last time. As if the man who had trained under Hiro Matsuda and taken pile drivers in the 1980s and beaten stage 4 cancer was, somewhere in there, still Paul Orndorff. Still Mr. Wonderful, still the same father who had raised him. They sat for a while. They talked, or tried to. Paul had good moments and bad moments now. Some sentences made sense, some did not. His son knew better than to correct him. His son just listened. Whatever his father wanted to say, whatever came out of his mouth, that was what mattered. This was not a conversation where the words needed to be right. This was a conversation where the presence mattered. Where the fact of a father and son being in the same room, at the end of one life and in the middle of another, was the whole point. And then, sometime past midnight, Paul decided it was time to go to bed. He got up. Slowly. His body could not do what it used to do. His right side was dead weight. His legs were unsteady. He needed help. Travis's wife stepped in on the left side. Travis stayed on the right because that was the weak side, the side where his father might fall. Between the two of them, they walked him down the hall to his bedroom. They got him to the bed, they lowered him down. They arranged the pillows. They made sure he was comfortable. Travis's wife was on the left. Travis was on the right. And then, in a moment that Travis would swear about for the rest of his life, in a moment that neither he nor his wife nor any doctor would ever be able to fully explain, the paralyzed right arm of Paul Orndorff moved. It moved. The arm that had been useless for years. The arm that had atrophied down to a fraction of its former size. The arm that had no signal traveling to it from the damaged nerves in his neck. That arm came up off the bed. It reached out. It gripped his son. Not weakly, not tentatively. It gripped him, and it pulled him close. Paul pulled Travis in with the arm that was not supposed to work. He pulled him down to his face, and he kissed him on the cheek. And then he spoke. 3 words. The last 3 words he would ever say to another human being while conscious. Trav, I love you. That was it. Those 3 words. Trav, I love you. Travis has said, in every interview he has given since, that he does not know how it happened. His father should not have been able to move that arm. His father should not have been able to grip anything with that hand. His wife saw it too. She confirmed it. They both watched it happen and could not explain it. But it happened. It really happened. Just once. Just enough to say goodbye, just enough to make sure that the last physical act Paul Orndorff ever performed in this world was reaching for his son and telling him he loved him. Paul laid back down. He closed his eyes. and he never got up again. Travis has said that he did not sleep that night. He sat in a chair next to his father's bed, listening to him breathe. Every few minutes, the breathing pattern would change. It would slow. It would go quiet for a beat too long. And Travis would lean forward thinking this was it, this was the moment. And then his father would take another breath, and Travis would exhale too, and the vigil would continue. The family stayed by his bed. Travis, his wife, his niece. They took shifts. They held his hand. They talked to him quietly even when he could not talk back. They put on music. They kept him company. They made sure that in the last hours of his life, Paul Orndorff was not alone. He was surrounded by the people who loved him. He was in his own home. He was warm. He was clean. He was cared for. He was, finally, at peace. The breathing got slower over the course of the day. The pauses got longer. His body was shutting down, system by system, the way bodies do at the end. There was no drama. There was no medical crisis. There was no emergency room. There was just a family in a bedroom, watching a good man die. At some point on July 12, 2021, Paul Orndorff took his last breath. His son was there. His son's wife was there. His niece was there. They stayed with him through it. They watched. They said their goodbyes. And when it was over, when the breathing finally stopped for good, they sat in that quiet room and let themselves feel what they were feeling. A husband was gone. A father was gone. A grandfather was gone. Mr. Wonderful was gone. 71 years of a remarkable life ended in the quietest room in the quietest house on the quietest street in Fayetteville, Georgia. Travis later described that final experience as horrible and wonderful at the same time. Horrible because he was watching his father die. Wonderful because he was there for it. Because he had gotten his father out of that medical facility. Because he had brought him home. Because he had given him a good death. A death in his own bed. A death with his family around him. A death where the last words his father spoke were words of love. He said, in one of his interviews, that being there for the beginning of his own life and the end of his father's life had been the most amazing experience of his existence. That the two moments were connected somehow. That his father had loved him into the world and he had loved his father out of it. But the story does not quite end there. Because there was one more piece of Paul Orndorff that needed to serve a purpose. His brain. Travis had made an arrangement months before with a man named Dr. Bennett Omalu. If that name sounds familiar, it should. Bennett Omalu is the forensic pathologist who discovered chronic traumatic encephalopathy in professional football players. He is the man whose research changed the way the National Football League thinks about concussions. He is the man Will Smith portrayed in the 2015 movie Concussion. And he was one of a small number of scientists in the world who was doing serious research on what repeated head trauma does to the brains of professional wrestlers. Travis had reached out. He had told Dr. Omalu that when his father passed, he wanted the brain donated for study. He wanted to know what wrestling had done to Paul Orndorff. He wanted the medical evidence. He wanted his father's death to mean something for the men who would come after him. Dr. Omalu had agreed. So when Paul Orndorff passed away on that Monday afternoon in Fayetteville, the arrangements were made. The brain was extracted. It was sent to Dr. Omalu's lab for examination. And when the results came back, they were exactly what Travis had feared, and worse. The scans showed extensive blood in the brain, extensive fluid, damage that had accumulated over decades. There was clear evidence of Alzheimer's disease. That part was already known. But the more shocking finding was in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is the part of the brain responsible for memory, for language processing, for making sense of what the eyes and ears are taking in. In a normal 71-year-old brain, the temporal lobe has already shrunk a little. In an Alzheimer's patient of the same age, it has shrunk considerably more. But in Paul Orndorff's brain, according to Travis relaying what the doctors told him, the temporal lobe was diminished beyond what an Alzheimer's patient would show. It had shriveled up in a way that no one on the medical team had ever seen before. Travis said that the technicians at the funeral home, who saw the brain when it was being prepared for donation, told him they had never encountered anything like it. Not shriveled up like this, not this bad. Never. The medical interpretation was significant. Paul Orndorff had a family history that included no Alzheimer's disease. Nobody in his lineage, as far as Travis knew, had ever been diagnosed with it. So the presence of Alzheimer's in his brain was already unusual, but the extreme atrophy of the temporal lobe, the extensive blood and fluid, the pattern of damage, all pointed to something else on top of the Alzheimer's. Something that had exacerbated it. Something that had taken whatever underlying dementia might have been there and cranked it up to a level 10. That something, in the opinion of the doctors who examined him, was decades of head trauma. Thousands of unprotected bumps. Hundreds of pile drivers, both given and received. The endless car crashes and hotel fights and street fights that came with a life in professional wrestling. The concussions that he had never sat out for. The bell rings that he had shaken off and gone back to work. It had all added up. It had all left evidence. And now, in a lab somewhere in the United States, that evidence was being cataloged. Paul Orndorff, in dying, had become one more data point in the growing scientific understanding of what professional wrestling does to the human brain. He had become, in his final act, a piece of evidence in a case against the industry he had loved. That felt right to his family. That felt like something he would have wanted, because he had lived by a code that said, if you know something is true, you have to say it. And what his brain was saying, in the language of shriveled temporal lobes and diffuse fluid, was true. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday, July 17, 2021, 5 days after his death. It was held at New Hope Baptist North in Fayetteville, Georgia. His body lay in state at 10 in the morning. The service began at 11. The officiant was Dr. Ike Reihard, a pastor who had personally led Paul Orndorff to Christ many years earlier. Travis wanted him to deliver the memorial. It was a full-circle moment. The man who had walked Paul into faith was going to walk him out of the world. The funeral was public. Travis had insisted on it. He wanted every fan who had loved his father to have the chance to say goodbye. And because so many of those fans lived in countries where they could never travel to Fayetteville, Georgia, he arranged for the entire service to be live-streamed. Fans in Peru watched it. Fans in Denmark watched it. Fans in China. Fans in Japan. Some of the messages of condolence that Travis received had to be professionally translated. The reach of Paul Orndorff's legacy, decades after his final match, was global. At the service, Paul was buried wearing his rings. His Hall of Fame rings. The 2005 WWE Hall of Fame ring. The 2009 NWA Hall of Fame ring. The 2017 George Tragos Lou Thesz ring. He had earned every one of them. He wanted them with him at the end. Travis made sure that he had them. The tributes came from every corner of the wrestling world. Hulk Hogan posted on Twitter that he had just gotten slammed with the news, that Paul had been his brother, that he had loved him, and thanked him for always making him fight for everything in their matches. That heaven had just gotten even more wonderful. Ric Flair, who had wrestled Paul for the NWA World Heavyweight Championship in one-hour matches in the early 80s, posted that he was sorry to hear about the passing, that Paul had been a great guy, legitimately tough, an amazing athlete. The Iron Sheik, who never gave anyone kind words easily, called Paul his brother and said Paul had been the toughest, that they had trained together and traveled together, and that he loved him forever. Eric Bischoff paid tribute. Comedian Bill Burr, a lifelong wrestling fan, tweeted that Paul had been one of the greatest of all time. WWE aired a memorial graphic on that night's episode of Monday Night Raw. And in the days after, a portrait of the man began to emerge that was not just about the wrestler. It was about the father, the husband, the grandfather, the friend, the man who had married his high school girlfriend Rhonda and stayed married to her, the man who had raised 2 sons, Paul III and Travis, the man who had 8 grandchildren, the man who, according to his son, was verbally rough with his opponents and gentle at home, the man who cared about his family more than he cared about anything else, including wrestling, including the physique he had spent his life building. That was the man who died on July 12, 2021. Not the character, not the persona, the man. And that brings us back to that final photograph, the one Travis's wife took on the night of July 11th, when Paul stood up and hugged his son. In that photograph, if you know what you're looking at, you can see everything that Paul Orndorff had left. You can see the atrophied right side, you can see the frailty, you can see the years of damage, but you can also see the arm around his son. You can see the head resting on his son's shoulder. You can see a man who had lost almost everything but was still holding on to the one thing that mattered. He was, by then, no longer the second biggest heel in the WWE, no longer the main eventer of Wrestlemania, no longer the drawing card of Toronto, no longer Mr. Wonderful. He was just a father, saying goodbye to his son. And when the moment came, when the last night arrived, when the paralyzed arm had to move one more time to complete the goodbye, his body found a way. Somewhere in the wreckage of his nervous system, some signal traveled down that arm one final time. And the last thing Paul Orndorff ever did with his body was hold on to someone he loved. That is the story that his son tells. That is the story that his wife confirms. That is the story that has been told and retold in the years since, in interviews and podcasts and tribute videos. And whether you believe every detail exactly the way it has been described, whether you believe a paralyzed arm can really move one last time out of love, the emotional truth of what happened in that bedroom in Fayetteville, Georgia is not in dispute. A man died at home. He died surrounded by family. He died having said what he needed to say. He died having heard what he needed to hear. That is not how most wrestlers of his era went out. Too many of them died alone. Too many of them died in hotel rooms. Too many of them died broke, or estranged, or forgotten. Paul Orndorff did not die that way. Whatever his last year had cost him, whatever the abuse and the neglect and the medical system and the industry had taken from him, in the end, he made it home. His son got him home. His son fought for him. And when the moment came, his son held his hand and did not let go until it was over. The final 48 hours of Paul Orndorff were quiet. They were small. They were nothing like the arenas he had headlined. There were no cameras. There was no pay-per-view. There was no crowd. There was just a bedroom and a family, and a beer, and a hug, and a last 3 words, and a last breath. There is a strange symmetry in the way it ended. Paul Orndorff had spent his career as a heel, a villain, a man whose job was to make crowds hate him. He had drawn boos in every arena in North America. He had made grown men throw drinks at him. He had been called every name in the book by fans who loved him for how much they got to hate him. And yet the last words spoken to him and by him on this earth were words of love. From his son, to his son, in a bedroom in Georgia, with his wife and his niece and his son standing by his bed. The Brandon Bull, the main eventer of the first Wrestlemania, the second biggest heel of the 80s, Boom, the man who had beaten stage 4 cancer, the man whose brain would become a piece of scientific evidence. All of that was over. What remained was a father telling his son that he loved him, and a son honoring that love by staying at his father's side until the very end. And in the end, maybe that is the best that any of us can hope for. Not the roar of the crowd, just the whisper of someone who loves us, saying our name for the last time. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button and subscribe for more wrestling documentaries like this one.